Okay, I'd like to get this hearing started. We were waiting for a Republican member to show up, but I understand Mr. Standy is on his way, and so we will begin this hearing. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out to today's Budget Subcommittee hearing on the Local Control Funding Formula, or LCFF. As we all know, LCFF was a huge shift in how schools are funded in the state of California. With the basic principle that under LCFF, additional support is needed for English learner, low-income, and foster youth students in order to close the achievement gap. However, as we continue to strive to reach full implementation of LCFF, we must not lose sight of the larger goal of making sure that we are providing more resources for all students in the state of California. In this hearing, we will first hear an overview of the new funding system. Representatives of the LAO, the Department of Education, and also the State Board of Education will be our first panel. And we will hear from them as to the implementation of the LCFF in year one. Additionally, I'm pleased to have a number of local superintendents from around the state here today to help us understand how districts and counties are implementing LCFF at the local level. I want to thank them for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today, and look forward to hearing about the work that you're doing in your districts. We will then discuss the Governor's 2014-2015 budget proposals pertaining to the LCFF. Specifically, the Governor's budget provides $4.5 billion for school districts and charter schools, and $26 million for county offices of education toward LCFF implementation. The Governor also proposes to create an automatic formula within Proposition 98 for LCFF funding. Furthermore, the Governor is proposing to shift 2 additional categorical programs into the LCFF. However, this subcommittee will be hearing these proposals regarding these 2 categorical programs on April 1st, when we discuss the larger subject of career technical education. Lastly, we will hear from the Legislative Analyst's Office regarding the home-to-school transportation program and their recommendations for creating a more equitable system for funding school transportation. Mr. Ting, do you have any opening comments? Okay. With that, we'd like to invite our first panel, representatives of the Legislative Analyst's Office, the Department of Education, and the State Board of Equalization.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, Mr. Ting. My name is Carolyn Chu from the Legislative Analyst's Office, and I've been asked to just give you a brief overview of the LCFF and the components that were adopted last year. So if you turn to page 1 of the handout that you should have in front of you, this just gives you a quick overview of how the new formula in terms of the funding portion works. So as you know, the LCFF replaced revenue limits and categorical programs and replaced them with a new formula that is applied to districts the same way across the state, and provides a grade span base rate with higher funding provided for the higher grades. The figure here on the first page sort of gives you the basics of how that formula works. For each English learner and low-income student in a district, the district receives a supplemental grant, which is worth 20% of the base grant. So as you can see in the figure, that's about $1,500 for a student in grades kindergarten through 3rd grade. The formula also includes concentration funding for districts that have particularly high proportions of low-income and English learner students, particularly if the district's enrollment of these students exceeds 55%. The district receives an additional concentration grant of 50% of the base grant for each student above that threshold. So turning to page 2, in conjunction with passing the new funding formula, the legislature also adopted a new system of accountability that's centered on 8 state priority areas, which are listed in the figure at the bottom of the page. The districts must also adopt local control and accountability plans, or LCAPs, and they must be adopted every 3 years but updated annually. Within these LCAPs, the districts must set their goals within the 8 state priority areas and identify the specific actions the district will take to meet these goals. And they must do so for every subgroup in the district, every subgroup of students, and for each school within the district. So turning to page 3, in addition to the LCAPs, the new accountability system included a new system of support and intervention for districts, and that support and intervention hinges on evaluation rubrics, which are currently under development by the State Board of Education. In addition, the new system created a new board for advice and support called the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, which we'll speak to in a little bit. So turning to page 4, here we just cover how districts receive support and intervention, and the figure at the bottom of the page goes through that in a bit more detail. But districts can receive support from their County Office of Education for 3 different reasons. 1, the district can request support and assistance. 2, they will receive support if their LCAP is not approved by the County Office of Education. And 3, if the district fails to improve student outcomes, then they'll receive support from the County Office of Education as well. And that has to occur in more than one state priority area for at least one subgroup. Now, in order for a district to receive intervention, 3 things must happen. 1, the district must fail to meet their goals in 3 out of 4 consecutive years for 3 or more subgroups in one or more in more than one state priority area. So there are 3 conditions there. The second condition is that the collaborative must determine that intervention in the district is necessary. And 3, the State Board of Education must approve intervention. So that's sort of the basics of the formula and the accountability system. A quick update on where we are with regards to implementation on page 5. Last year, the Budget Act provided $2.1 billion above the prior year funding level to start implementing the new formula. As you'll recall, the new base rates are significantly higher than revenue limits. So this closed approximately 12% of the difference between where districts had been funded and where we aim to fund them under the local control funding formula. In addition, in January, the State Board of Education adopted regulations regarding the use of supplement and concentration funding, and I think they'll speak to that in more detail shortly. And they also adopted the new LCAP templates that districts must use when developing their LCAPs. There are a couple remaining elements yet to happen. Districts will be adopting their first LCAPs this July, by July 1st. And the State Board of Education will have to develop the evaluation rubrics by October of next year, 2015. Lastly, the role of the collaborative is still under development, and I think the Department of Education and State Board will speak to some of those details as well. So that's all I have on the overview, but please let me know if you have any questions.
All right, why don't we hold off on the questions until all of our panelists have had an opportunity to present. So next, thank you very much, Ms. Chu. Is this mic on? Okay. Next, I'd like to welcome Monique Ramos from the Department of Education.
Good morning, Monique Ramos on behalf of State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tom Torlakson. Implementation for the local control funding formula began immediately after the law was passed. CDE has apportioned cash to LEAs based upon its estimation of state aid that LEAs received under LCFF. So that allocation is about 95% of what LEAs received last year. Most recently, we did a recalculation to include average daily attendance and property tax receipts. This is frequently referred to as P1. That just brings us up to date as to where we currently are. The work we've been doing over the last 6 to 7 months has come a long way in the implementation. We've worked with the administration to resolve implementation issues and identify necessary statutory cleanup. We've updated our apportionment data collection software to reflect the department's interim solution for allocating dollars this year until we allocate based on the new formula. We've identified all the data collection requirements for implementing the new formula, which we will implement essentially fully next year, and we've nearly completed building the new data collection software. That software will be released in March, and we will be providing training to the field on it. The department has been meeting monthly with county offices of education to give them updates on the implementation. As well, we are constantly updating CDE's LCFF Frequently Asked Questions website. We are providing assistance to county superintendents associations, which built the calculator that helps LEAs estimate their LCFF entitlement. The calculator has since been handed over to FCMAT, and the department continues to provide technical assistance. We have re-released budgeting and fiscal reporting software used by LEAs to incorporate key components of the new funding formula. We have convened the committee that was required under AB 97 to revise criteria and standards used to assess LEA's fiscal solvency. We have incorporated many of the LCFF changes into the new audit guide, which is used by independent auditors for 13-14 and 14-15 audits. As an aside, this is the largest change in the audit guide in recent history. And we have also worked on the proposed changes and regulations needed to implement the apportionments to K-3 class sizes. While the department would prefer to be further along in its implementation, we are on target to have principal apportionments by July 2nd based on the new local control funding formula. This has been a large task for the department, and we have pretty much completely directed our school fiscal services division along with a lot of other staff to work on this. And with me I have Peter Fajago, Director from School Fiscal Services, to answer any technical questions if they arise.
All right, and last but not least, we'd like to welcome Lisa Wynn, representing the State Board of Education.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair and members. As mentioned previously, the State Board adopted emergency regulations in January, which were approved by the Office of Administrative Law. These are in place for 180 days. The regulations include both expenditure regulations and the Local Control and Accountability Plan, or what we call the LCAP template. LEAs must complete their LCAP by July 1st, 2014 using the template and abide by the expenditure regulations. Also in January, at the same time, the board began the permanent rulemaking process. Currently, we are within our 45-day public comment period on the permanent regulations that ends on March 17th. A State Board of Education, working with Department of Education staff, must respond to, and then the board will consider each and every one of those comments. When the permanent regulations come back to the board, it'll likely be in either May or July. Of course, we don't know yet that what changes will be made to the permanent regulations as part of this process, but as a result, there may be some changes to the expenditure regulations or the template for the 15-16 cycle as we work out those permanent regulations. State Board staff, along with CDE staff and our contractor, WestEd, are in the initial process of planning for the development of the evaluation rubric. Statute requires the board to adopt by October 1st, 2015, an evaluation rubric or rubrics that allow LEAs to do self-evaluations, identify LEAs in need of technical assistance, and allow the superintendent of public instruction to identify LEAs in need of intervention. The development of a rubric will build off the requirements in the regulations and the LCAP and be informed by this initial LCAP adoption cycle. We are also working closely with the department on developing a vision for the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence that supports and is integrated with the rest of this LCFF accountability system that we're working on building. The State Board will include an LCFF update item in each of their board agendas for this year and likely for the next few years in March, and our agenda was posted on our website on Friday if folks are interested in looking at that. In March, our LCFF update item will discuss resources that staff are working on that will be posted by that point on the website that are in development by SBE staff, CDE staff, and our contractor WestEd to assist LEAs as they complete this first LCAP. The item will also feature a county office and a district to share their LCAP process up to this point, and a few organizations who have created materials to model promising LCAP practices. And likely we will have this type of feedback loop at each board meeting going forward. Our board members have made it pretty clear that, this is a process. They want to closely monitor the implementation of LCFF and make adjustments as needed. Finally, I'll note that if you've been following it, the adoption of our emergency regulations was a long process. We worked for many months on that. The Department of Education, SBE, and WestEd did extensive outreach to stakeholders throughout that process, through meetings, calls, to make sure that we heard from everyone. And we're continuing this practice of reaching out to all education stakeholders as we move forward through regular calls and requests for feedback, so we can hear that same feedback about how this implementation is going moving forward, and we can share that with our board members going forward.
All right. Thank you very much. Now we will have an opportunity to ask some questions, and I'd like to start off by asking you, Ms. Wen. Well, first of all, I think many of us, including myself, are pleased to see the governor's January budget proposal include a significant increase in funding for LCFF. We are all committed to making LCFF work. However, at the same time, I want to make sure that as the State Board labored through the lengthy hearing process to ensure that the basic principle of LCFF was implemented, that is that the dollars that are intended for the disadvantaged students actually reach the disadvantaged students. And so, I know that the basic underlying principle of LCFF was this principle of subsidiarity, that local districts, that local control was important because the local school board members and superintendents are seen. We want to believe that they are, in touch the most with local needs. However, recently in the Los Angeles County, there was a high-profile disclosure of, as one example, a superintendent in the Centinela Valley High School District that received a total compensation of over $660,000 last year. And, although the compensation, his contract was implemented before LCFF came into effect, the concern is that the Centinela Valley is a school district of over 600,000 kids, overwhelmingly Title I, large population of English language learners. This situation in Centinela Valley seems to highlight the flip side of local control. That is the concern that local boards and superintendents do not govern appropriately and abuse the additional dollars that are meant for the disadvantaged students. So you mentioned the state board is in the process of adopting expenditure regulations and LCAP regulations. Those are two separate regulations?
They're part of the same regulations package, the way it's structured, but they're expenditure regulations, and then there's an LCAP template.
Okay.
And they were both adopted in January as emergency regs, and now we're going through the process which will install them as permanent regs.
Mm-hmm. So within the expenditure regulations, is there anything that would address or try to prevent what is largely seen, where the Centinela Valley, I understand that districts need to offer competitive compensation packages to attract qualified management personnel. But here, we have the very easy example of comparing the Centinela Valley superintendent with the superintendent of LAUSD, superintendent of over 660,000 students, receiving less than a half of the Sentinel Valley superintendent. And so is the state board discussing any regulations that would help prevent this kind of abuse?
Sure. So we've heard a lot of this case and other cases. There's a lot of nervousness as folks start to work through the new LCFF accountability system. And again, we're part of doing, the formal legal process for permanent regulations. And as those comments come in, we'll look at those. I will note that the expenditure regulations that are in place now, are grounded in statute, which require that LEAs must increase or improve services for their unduplicated students, English learners, low-income or foster youth in proportion to the additional funding they generate. The regulations that are in place now establish a consistent methodology for determining how much supplemental and concentration grant funding an LEA receives in a given year. And generates a percentage which provides for how much more in services an LEA must provide to its unduplicated students over what they provide to all their students generally. Mm-hmm. And then the LEA must describe how they're meeting this and support this in their LCAP. So while we've heard, conversations like this, there's also been conversations about, salary increases in general. Again, as folks work through this first year of LCAP, they must still meet those expenditure regulations and balance, all those different needs of their local community in their LCAP. I'd also say that the LCAP provides a level of transparency locally that wasn't necessarily present in all districts under the old system. Mm-hmm. And this really adds and reinforces the accountability of LCFF. In addition, as folks complete their first LCAPs, they'll be going to the county office for review to ensure that they are meeting these regulations. Mm-hmm. So while many of these things are in place to help address issues, again, we're at the very beginning stages, so we'll be watching and monitoring as these things roll out.
Yeah. I do appreciate how the current regulations are being discussed so that, you're discussing regulations to ensure that a certain percentage of dollars are spent on the 8 state priority areas that were identified. But my understanding of even of the, I was trying to look at the LAO's chart on the 8 priority areas, and I couldn't figure out how, the financial expenditure regulations, for these 8 priority areas would address, the issue of staff and in particular administrator compensation.
Sure. So. Our expenditure with our expenditure regulations, we also adopted the LCAP template, mm-hmm. and in that template, it's posted on both CDE website and State Board in their January agenda when we adopted it. Mm-hmm. Asked the district to not only go through all of the 8 state priority areas, set goals, and set their actions and expenditures for achieving those goals, but also has a separate section that backs up the expenditure regulations around providing those additional services to unduplicated students. And within the LCAP, the LEA has to explain and describe how they're meeting those requirements for their unduplicated students. Mm-hmm. So while they may in their LCAP discuss, other things that they're doing and how they're meeting all of their goals for all students, and as part of that, it could include, salary increases in some cases. This can be all of your LCFF funding as well as additional funding that you're talking about in your LCAP. Specifically at the end, you must talk about your supplemental and concentration grant funding, and then how you're meeting your proportionality percentage, how you're meeting those needs for your unduplicated students. So it should be very clearly and transparently laid out how they're meeting those mm-hmm. regulations, and the county offices will be checking that.
Okay, so for example, looking at the 8 state priorities, mm-hmm. which of the 8, how would this proposed system address the issue of superintendent compensation?
Well, within the 8 state priorities, as districts will describe how they're meeting each of those, whether, superintendent compensation is included in there. If they think it is linked to a goal, they may include it. Of course, this, could be throughout using all their LCFF funds, but they also must detail for their community how they're going to meet outcomes in all these areas, and they're going to have to balance that with any compensation packages they're providing. And then at the end, they'll also have to address that specific issue of supplemental and concentration grant funds. So there is not a specific area that asks you to lay out those compensation packages, but there are, in each of those areas, you'll have to lay out your goals, which you'll have to discuss with your community, and then talk about how you're going to get to those goals. And as you do that process transparently and locally, you'll be balancing the needs of various areas you want to spend money on, whether it's compensation, whether it's additional hours for students, additional programs.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I have a hard time imagining how, for example, so I guess the proposed system is that the County Office of Education would approve or not approve a district's LCAP. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So is the State Board of Education contemplating regulations where they would foresee a County Office of Education rejecting a district's LCAP for, say, excessive compensation?
Currently, statute lays out the conditions under which a county office cannot approve an LCAP. If they're not filling out the template completely, if they're not completing the regulations. So there's currently in statute for what they can disapprove for. And so that's on the front end. On the back end, districts are required to meet the goals that they're setting in their LCAPs. And as Carolyn spoke to earlier, then there are supports in county office, from the county offices in the way of technical assistance and interventions down the line. So to the extent, a district maybe doesn't quite get the right balance and doesn't meet those outcomes, they will have that technical assistance and support, which will come in and not only look at their programs, but likely how they are spreading their funding and what they're using it for. So there's kind of a two-tiered, meet the requirements at the beginning, and then if those outcomes don't come in, you'll have those additional supports and interventions.
All right.
What I can also do is share a copy of the template with folks and the regs if you'd like, and I think that might help to detail what districts are looking at as they go forward.
All right. Thank you. Sure. Let me just wrap up, at least from my end. I am concerned about making sure, again, that the LCFF dollars are used properly, transparently, in an accountable way. I have introduced legislation, to try to ensure some of those accountability controls. But I appreciate your responses, and I look forward to working with all of you. Mr. Ting.
So just as a follow-up along the chair's questions, if you have a school board that approves the superintendent's salary and you give a superintendent receiving a salary, why would either of them raise it as a flag?
Sure, you're correct. I mean, there isn't a layer of local control here that was, and some of these things, like we said, were put in place before LCFF, and they may still be able to, they can still set the salary compensation packages locally now as well. Again, they do have to show their community what goals they've set, how they're getting to those goals, and what expenditures they're providing to get to those goals, as well as how they're spending their supplemental and concentration grant funds. So as they, as LEAs consider their compensation packages for administrators or for teachers for that matter, they'll have to balance it with everything else that they're doing, explain it to their community. If their community supports it, you're right, the board can still approve that. And it'll go to the county office, and as long as they're meeting the regulations.
But we've seen circumstances like Bell where communities are really unaware that this is going on, that clearly this issue has been brought to your attention, so what's the state board planning on doing about the situation? Because clearly this is a salary situation which is completely out of the norm and really not justifiable. So I'd like to understand what action the state board plans on taking.
Sure. So the state board, they have authority to set regulations under the requirements of statute, which don't speak specifically to this issue. We have heard concerns such as yours, and we're likely to hear those as part of our permanent regulations package. And so we will be looking at that. The board will look at those suggestions for changes. To address a variety of issues. Likely there may be some comments, including this, which we'll look at as part of permanent regulations.
Well, I guess, does the board have the authority to address this issue?
We statute specifically asked for expenditure regulations around increasing or improving services for those unduplicated students, as well as an LCAP template. So there may be of course, some modifications to those that can be made. It would depend on the suggested change